If I asked you a simple question, how much of a company do you need to own before you can shape how it's run? Most people would probably give the same answer, 51%. After all, if you own more than half the company, you own the majority of the votes. You can elect whoever you want, reject whoever you don't, and ultimately steer the direction of the business. It sounds obvious. In fact, it's one of the first ideas people develop about companies. Majority ownership is how you get control of a company. But that intuition contains one fatal flaw. Because in the real world, some of the most powerful people in finance have discovered they don't need to own the company at all. They simply need to convince the people who already do. In 2017, one man set his sights on one of the largest consumer businesses on the planet. A company whose products are sitting in your bathroom, your kitchen, your laundry room, and probably somewhere within arm's reach of you right now. At the time, this company was worth well over $200 billion. It had survived recessions, wars, technological revolutions, and more than a century of competition. It wasn't a struggling business. It was one of corporate America's crown jewels. That company was Procter Gamble. The challenger wasn't another multinational corporation. He wasn't launching a takeover. He wasn't making an acquisition. He wasn't even trying to buy the company. Instead, he quietly accumulated a stake worth less than 2% of Procter Gamble. By any ordinary standard, that should have made him almost irrelevant. 98% of the company belonged to somebody else. Yet within months, the entire leadership of Procter & Gamble was forced into one of the most expensive and closely fought corporate elections in American history. Millions of shareholders were asked to choose sides. The world's largest asset managers were pulled into the battle. The man who started all of this was Nelson Peltz, and what he was attempting wasn't a hostile takeover. It was something far more elegant, a proxy fight. To understand why someone with less than 2% ownership could shake one of the largest companies in the world, we first have to abandon the biggest misconception about corporate power. Because billion-dollar companies aren't controlled the way most people think they are. We first need to answer a deceptively simple question. Who actually runs a public company? Most people would answer, the CEO. After all, they're the face of the company. They're on earnings calls, announcing acquisitions, unveiling new products, making strategic decisions, and appearing in the media. But in reality, the CEO is not the highest authority inside a corporation. That someone is the board of directors. Every public company has one. Think of the board as the company's governing body. They don't design the products, they don't manage factories, they don't negotiate with customers. Instead, they oversee the people who do. Their responsibilities are far more consequential. They appoint the CEO. They approve major acquisitions. They oversee executive compensation. They authorize massive capital allocation decisions. In other words, they decide who gets to run the business. If you can influence the board, you can influence everything that happens beneath it, even the future of the company itself. Suddenly, owning the company isn't the only path to power. Winning influence over the board can be just as powerful. This brings us to the next piece of the puzzle. If the board is so powerful, who decides who sits on it? The shareholders. Every share of stock typically comes with a vote. And at annual shareholder meetings, investors vote on the directors. Which brings us to the misconception at the heart of this story. Companies like Procter & Gamble aren't owned by one person. They're owned by millions of shareholders, pension funds, mutual funds, index funds, hedge funds, and ordinary investors around the world. No single investor comes anywhere close to owning a majority. So when people hear that an activist owns just 1 or 2% of a company, they assume they're powerless. But an activist is not trying to outvote everyone. They're trying to persuade enough shareholders that the current board is making poor decisions. And if enough investors agree, those investors can collectively vote to replace directors. This is the first major lesson that most retail investors never realize. On Wall Street, ownership creates influence, but persuasion creates power. An activist investor doesn't walk into a boardroom waving a check. They walk in with an argument. And if they succeed in convincing everyone else that the company could be run better, even a stake of less than 2% can become the catalyst for changing the future of a company worth hundreds of billions of dollars. Which brings us back to Nelson Peltz. He understood all of this. The only question was, could he convince the rest of the shareholders? By 2017, Procter Gamble looked like exactly the kind of company most investors dream of owning. It had existed for nearly 2 centuries. Its brands were household names across the globe: Tide, Gillette, Pampers, Oral-B, Head and Shoulders. On paper, it looked almost untouchable. But Nelson Peltz wasn't looking at the brands. He was looking at the numbers. Over the previous decade, P&G had gone through one of the largest restructuring programs in corporate history. More than 100 brands had been sold or discontinued. Billions of dollars had been spent trying to simplify the business. Management promised that a leaner company would grow faster and become more profitable. Yet despite the scale of the restructuring, P&G continued to lag some of its peers. To Peltz, this wasn't a company with bad products. It was a company with a management problem. So Peltz did something that, at first glance, seemed almost meaningless. Through his hedge fund, Trian Fund Management, he accumulated roughly a 1.5% stake in Procter Gamble. If his goal had been to take over P&G, it was hopeless. 98% of the company belonged to somebody else, but that was never the objective. Peltz wasn't buying control. He was buying credibility. Owning a meaningful stake gave him something invaluable: the right to say, "I have billions of dollars invested alongside you. I want this company to succeed too, but I believe it's being run the wrong way." Then came the next move. He made his case public. He argued that Procter & Gamble had become too bureaucratic. His proposal was to join the board and push management toward a faster, more accountable culture. To many shareholders, that sounded reasonable. To P&G's leadership, it sounded like a direct challenge to their authority. Procter & Gamble didn't simply welcome Peltz onto the board. They fought him publicly. Management insisted the company was already executing the right strategy. Suddenly, this wasn't a disagreement behind closed doors. It had become an election. Think about that for a moment. Millions of shareholders, thousands of institutions, 2 competing visions for the future of one of the world's largest companies. And every single vote mattered. This is why it's called a proxy fight. Most shareholders never attend annual meetings in person. Instead, they authorize someone else, a proxy, to cast their vote on their behalf. Peltz wasn't asking investors to sell him their shares. He was asking them for something much more valuable: their vote. At this point, the battle was no longer about Nelson Peltz. It was about everyone else, because in companies like Procter & Gamble, the largest shareholders are often enormous institutions: index fund managers, pension funds, asset managers overseeing trillions of dollars. Individually, none of them wanted to run Procter & Gamble, but collectively, they would decide who did. Peltz spent months meeting investors, explaining his thesis, answering questions, and trying to convince them that change was necessary. Meanwhile, P&G's management was doing exactly the same thing, from the opposite side. This wasn't a battle of balance sheets anymore. It was a battle of persuasion. When the votes were finally counted, it appeared that Nelson Peltz had lost, by a margin so small that it represented only a tiny fraction of the billions of shares outstanding. For most elections, that would have been the end of the story. But this wasn't most elections. The margin was so extraordinarily close that the votes were recounted. And after the recount, the outcome flipped. Peltz hadn't lost. He had won a seat on Procter Gamble's board of directors. Think about what had just happened. A man owning less than 2% of one of the largest companies on earth had successfully convinced enough of the other 98% to place him inside the room where the most important decisions would now be made. He hadn't bought control. He had earned influence. In the end, Nelson Peltz didn't become the CEO of Procter & Gamble. He didn't take over the company. He didn't replace the entire board. He won a single seat. To many people, that might sound insignificant, but inside a boardroom, influence isn't measured by how many shares you own. It's measured by the decisions you help shape. And perhaps that's the most important lesson from this entire story. A proxy fight isn't about taking ownership of a company. It's about earning the trust of the people who already own it. Peltz didn't overpower Procter & Gamble. He persuaded enough shareholders that his vision deserved representation inside the boardroom. And this is precisely why activist investors command so much attention. That's an extraordinary feature of public markets. Corporate control isn't decided once, it's continuously earned. Every annual meeting, every shareholder vote, every major strategic decision. Management is accountable to the owners. And if enough owners decide they want something different, they have a mechanism to make it happen.